No place like the Cube.
Queer news, queer news, queer
Family, it's your favorite queer radio personality, Anna DeShawn here, and I am excited to finally share this interview that I had with Raquel Willis. It's about her new book, The Risk It Takes to Bloom on Life and Liberation. When we talked, the book hadn't come out yet, so you'll hear a little bit of that, but the book is out, and I'm telling y'all, go pick it up. It's worth the read. Raquel is brilliant, and she's so vulnerable in this book to share so much about her life and the risk that it took to bloom. So I hope you enjoy this interview, and family, there'll be more of this to come. Till Monday. Peace.
queer news, queer news, queer
Family, what's good? You know, this is your favorite queer radio personality, Anna DeShawn, and this is Queer News, your favorite queer weekly podcast at the intersections of race, sexuality, and culture. Today, I am excited and grateful and honored to have the Raquel Willis joining us for this interview. What's going on, Raquel?
Not much. I'm so excited to be on.
Yes, indeed. We're going to have a good time today. We're going to be talking about her new book that is coming out. Yo, I got like a copy. This is like a situation. And
You're
so it's
legit.
really dope. Yo, I'm legit. I'm like getting emails from people. They're like, yo, we should do this interview. I'm like, absolutely. So we're going to talk about her book. But before we get into it, I don't know, maybe you're listening to this pod and you don't know her, which would be odd. But if you are one of those people, let me just give you a little rundown. Raquel is an award-winning activist, author, and media strategist dedicated to Black transgender liberation. All right? Let's get some stats. Okay, she's been the director of communications for the Miss Foundation for Women, executive editor of Out Magazine, also the first Black trans woman to be executive editor, okay? National organizer for a Transgender Law Center. She also co-founded Transgender Week of Visibility and Action. She currently serves as the executive producer for iHeartMedia's Outspoken. She's currently the president of Solutions Not Punishments Collaboratives. Child, and somewhere in the long way, she's also the WNBA Social Justice Council member, and she wrote a memoir. Her memoir is called The Risk It Takes to Bloom on Life and Liberation. Whoo, you do all that, huh?
It's a lot. When you read it all like that, yes, it's a lot. But, you know, so much of that is from the course of over 10 years of a career. So, you know, I don't want anyone to hear that and be like, this girl is like everywhere all at once.
Not all at once, but work, right? It's just your life's work. And it's culminated to this beautiful book you've put together. And we're going to dig in. But this is a podcast produced by E3 Radio, which is our queer radio station. So, you know, I think a beautiful way to get to know people is through the music that they are listening to. So we got a few music questions we kick off every interview with. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's go.
Let's go. So what's your go-to karaoke song?
Oh, my go-to karaoke song?
Yeah.
Oh, Lord. Okay, look. This is controversial because Mama is... I don't even know how to describe what Mama is going through right now, but it has to be Nikki.
Oh.
And honestly, it's probably
Okay.
Itty Bitty Piggy.
Okay, I see you.
Yeah.
I see you. Mm-hmm.
I know, which is why I know it's controversial.
Oh,
but
man.
I love a Nikki moment on karaoke. I also love I'm big into the rap moment. So a Missy song could work too. Work It is great. Because I'm not a singer, you know, and
okay.
You don't even want to hear me fake sing. So
come on, you from Georgia? You got to be a little hum in you somewhere up in there.
Yes, the slightest of hums.
All right, what song is getting the most plays in your phone right now?
right now. That water song, make me sweat,
It's in my head
make
all
me
day.
harder.
Yes.
That
Make me
song,
lose my breath. Hey,
it's got me in a chokehold. I can't even lie.
yeah, I'm with you with that. Now, if you did, so you don't sing, but you do rap. So if you had like your dream collab with that rapper, you was gonna go in, it was gonna be that one. What's that dream collab look like?
Well, I like another rapper that's out right now, but she's too controversial too. But Meg, I love Meg, and I love whenever she does like a Southern girl link up. So, you
Facts.
know, Meg is like that girl to me
Meg is
right
that
now.
girl.
Yeah.
Meg is that girl. I appreciate her work. I appreciate how she shows up. I'm with it. I'm with it. All right. So I will say this too, is that the Trans Youth Town Hall,
Mm-hmm.
that 3-part series, it was so incredibly important and powerful. I actually use that as a resource when people come to me. Teachers come to me and ask me things, and I say, you just need to watch this series because the humanity is what people often do not see.
Mm.
And we talk about how important storytelling is in our life, but it's different when you get to see people and hear people's humanity. And I feel like that came through so well in that series. What did it mean for you to produce it, host it?
Oh, I mean, that was definitely one of those moments during the time when I was like fully kind of, I guess, transitioning into movement auntie mode.
It was definitely an auntie moment. Yes.
Because I just had to, realize and I guess reckon with the fact that there are younger folks coming up after us, right? I think for so long in my 20s or so, there was very clear kind of idea that like this is its own generation and we have a different relationship to our identities, maybe even to our power in some way. And so there are a lot of Black trans people who were doing new things, like we were straddling LGBTQ plus movement work and trans movement work, but also the movement for Black lives. And so we were probably the first generation that had a large group of us also doing specifically Black liberation work too. So that has felt like its own particular thing. But then to know that there's this younger group that's coming up that's also having their own experiences, right? They're being radicalized in a different way with all of the very targeted legislation against them. I mean, they have conservative politicians who have their experiences in their mouths every day. And that's even a different experience. So with that context, I mean, being able to work on this and use my platform to elevate young people who don't get a chance to speak for themselves was so powerful.
Yeah, and I felt that. And you're right. I feel like, I just knocked on 40's door, and my reality growing up is just so radically different than theirs. And in so many ways, especially when we talk politically, when we talk about what rights we have and don't have, where the conversation was always about marriage, which, child, okay. It's a privileged conversation to be having anyway, right? But that was the fight of my like 20s and 30s, but their fight is so much different, and going to school during COVID. And I feel like we don't hold space for them enough to respect their own experiences and how liberated they are in their own identities while still being so politicized, which is not something that I experience in its totality as in the same ways that they do. So it has nothing to do with this book, but I I just wanted to say that because I just felt like it was such an important work.
No, you're right. You're right. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think it's something we all have to contend with and think about. We forget that the youth are marginalized, right? It's interesting, like young people across the board, across identity are marginalized because so often, I've been jokingly calling us moldy old adults, right? But we like to put our own prescriptions onto their experiences. And we have to have an intense amount of humility around where our experience begins and ends and where theirs begins and ends. And that's something that I also just remember as a young queer and trans kid without all that language growing up in Augusta, Georgia, in the 90s and 2000s. The adults around me, I was very acutely aware, did not have the range to understand what I was experiencing. Mm-hmm. And I think oftentimes we don't remember that was how we felt. And so we have to do that extra bit of work to remember that, to uncover that. So that feels so important. And then the other thing I'll say, right, about the youth, while they also are marginalized, so much of our progress starts with young people, So when I think about the college campuses across the country, I mean, historically, I think about organizing around anti-war, which is, of course, coming up in a different way now, organizing around or combating capitalism and its ills, or even some of the discussions around queer and trans people's access started in colleges. I remember when I was in college 12 or so years ago, we were talking about gender neutral restrooms, getting the non-discrimination and anti-harassment policy at the University of Georgia to include gender identity alongside sexual orientation. So we were doing that work before it spilled over into general society.
Because campuses are such a great place for that work to be done. Mm-hmm. And it's hard when you feel like you've passed a moment, and I feel like the 20s and your 30s are a moment, and when you feel like you've passed that moment, you forget what it was like. It's so easy to forget what it was like, and you start saying things like your parents used to say, "Oh, those young people, oh, the kids, they got it easy today," and there's nothing easy about living your truth. I don't care what day it is. It's especially when there's so many people attacking you. And when social media is what it is today. So all that
and
said,
that's a word within it. What it is today.
What it is today was not what it was yesterday. All right. Which leads us to your memoir, The Risk It Takes to Bloom, on life and liberation. When I opened the book, one of the first things it says is, "To all who have ever doubted their place in the garden of liberation." I think this speaks to who exactly you're writing this book for. Tell us about who that is.
Yeah. Well, I think at the heart of it, of course, is queer and trans people. Folks who overwhelmingly are brought into this world by people who are ill-equipped to fully understand them, reckon with them and who they will be. But also, in general, I think we all face mountains of expectations around who we're supposed to be in the world. And so, of course, queer and trans people, and particularly Black queer and trans people, are always at the center for me. And also, I think there's a universal experience of having to or needing to chart a path outside of the expectations that are put on us. And I hope that the cis folks, the non-Black folks, the straight folks can glean something from this journey that I'm taking folks on.
Yeah. And I'd love for you to tell me the idea around blooming and, right, you have 4 parts: rooting, budding, pruning, and blooming. And it's all centered around, I thought of a garden, I think of flowers, right? I think of all these things from the roots. I started thinking about Tupac, Rose Grew from Concrete. Right? All these things. Tell me about why you centered that in this book.
Well, a couple of things. So one of the first little snippets of my childhood that I talk about is growing up in Augusta, Georgia, And I have this neighbor, or my family has this neighbor that has like a magnolia tree. And so it has like branches reaching over. And I share this little like anecdote of being mesmerized by the tree, like the sense of like the flower buds and like the creamy petals and everything. But having this streak of fear that's like, oh, I'm being raised as a boy. I'm not supposed to like these things. I can't let on that I like these things. I can't tap into that part of myself. And so that really is one of those noticings that I liken to this kind of idea that I feel like my father instilled in me, was that I didn't deserve softness or affection in a way. And I kind of unpack what that felt like. And later on, I write a letter to him that kind of extends some grace for why he felt that way, because for him, as this traditional Southern Black man, also Catholic, you know, to raise a little boy child meant to raise them up to be able to weather the storms of being Black and being a man in America, right? And so I can hold that, and also hold the deep kind of hurt that came from being told that I didn't deserve softness and affection in a particular way. Mm-hmm. So that is one of those kind of formative moments for me, that kind of noticing that, oh, I'm supposed to be a certain way, even though I have these internal desires. And then the other is, you know, this poem. The poem is, and the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. Well, when I heard that, I initially heard it as the start of Alicia Keys' her third album, The Element of Freedom. And she changed blossom to bloom. And so I always loved that. And so with that, I quote the original poet, but I also kind of named that Alicia Keys was my gateway to hearing that. And when I heard that, I was in my freshman year of college, and I was just starting to have this kind of articulation around gender and my relationship to my femininity throughout life. So there are these like two kind of distinct moments that kind of blended together so beautifully.
And I think they're so relatable, especially for Black, brown, queer, trans folks, in that there is this moment where you realize you are different. Mm-hmm. There's this moment where you realize, oh, I may not be exactly the way people want me to be. But I know for me, and I'll use I statements, you know, my dad and I have the same initials. And so he gets his initials engraved on his shirts. And so when I was a shorty, I was like, oh, that's so dope. I put on his shirts. My dad is a 3X. Okay, there is no way I'm even fitting his shirts. I would put on his button-up shirts and go to church, you know? Mm-hmm. And when you look around, like, there's no other girls wearing this. And you immediately feel othered. And you begin to wonder, how am I going to be in the world? Like, who will I be loved in the world? Will my family still love me in the way that I am? And when you realize who you are, you're sitting there, you're just like, what else am I going to do? Am I going to be who I feel like I am from the inside out here in the world? Or I'm going to succumb to what the pressures of society and my family and the standards of this binary say that I'm supposed to be?
Right.
And there's so much around the flower and the garden that speaks to that, like such a beautiful analogy between the two. So I love that that's the direction that you went with this book, and sort of how you align your story, you know, with something that happens so naturally in the world, because that's how I feel like we are. We're just who we are. And throughout this book, you also write some letters to people throughout this book. I think you told me you wrote 4. Can you tell us why you wanted to write letters in your book and what they meant to you?
Well, initially they were called wilting letters, and I was kind of thinking of the unfortunate dynamic is that death is often a catalyst for us to rethink ourselves and our place in the world. And I think especially when you're on the margins, whether as a Black person or as a queer and trans person, we have all of these deaths that kind of stack up in our hearts, right? And for some people, that includes, for instance, like the murder of George Floyd, right? Or numerous Black trans women. Two of the letters are to Black trans women, Layleen Polanco, who died in Rikers custody, so basically to state violence, and China Dahl Dupree, or China Gibson, who was murdered in Louisiana. But then also, I just kind of thought about another young trans woman who died by suicide, Leila Alcorn, and also my father's death. And so these were moments that really shifted how I thought about the world. With my father, that was a huge catalyst for me to kind of own my transness and womanhood in a new way, because the kind of nuanced piece of his death was like, yes, of course, I was mourning and grieving, and also in a way I was freed from expectations that he had around masculinity, but also freed from this idea that I should live this brief, short life based on other people's standards. With Leila Alcorn in 2014, her death by suicide, so she had a letter published on Tumblr after she died, and it basically was a call to action to adults to fix society, because she didn't see a future for herself as a trans person. With China Gibson, I was working at Transgender Law Center, and her death, we were both, so I talk about my experience with bottom surgery kind of later, after I talk about her story, but she was on track to have bottom surgery the same month that I was. And so that was one of the pieces that kind of touched me, along with the fact that she had been a bit of a showgirl, and I had done drag performance in college. And so there were so many pieces there that were so intertwined. And so with her death, I just felt kind of the wild feeling that I think a lot of us feel of, oh, I'm one of the ones who survived, and I get to have this life, and your life was taken. And so what does that mean? And her death was a catalyst for me to dig deeper into doing specifically Black trans-centered work, because before that, I had a bit of fear in naming anti-Blackness, even in this kind of nonprofit social justice space, because those spaces are seen as the most progressive. And then with Layleen and her death at Rikers custody, which I also am hosting a podcast that delves into her life story, I saw how she galvanized so many different organizers and activists in New York, just by the sheer virtue of who she was. So she had been a sex worker. She galvanized the decrim sex work movement here in New York. She had been held in solitary confinement, so she galvanized the end solitary movement here in New York. But just in general, she also galvanized so many of us to take Black trans lives more seriously during that social justice uprising in the summer of 2020. So these letters were an opportunity for me to speak directly to these people who completely transformed my life in so many different ways.
And we also don't, yeah, thank you for sharing that, because this past week, I just reported on 3 Black trans women who were murdered in the last 2 weeks. And,
Mhm.
you know, I can remember there was somebody on social who had done a video, and they were just like, they were downplaying the impact of Black trans women being murdered and just saying the number of Black people being killed don't even compare. And I think about that person because that is the type of hate that is continuing to perpetuate the violence against our trans siblings. Now, your decades of work have led to this memoir. How vulnerable of a process was it to put this book together and to say, I'm about to just tell my life story out here in the world in this way?
Well, I think it was certainly a culmination of course, years of lived experience. So when I was in journalism school, so I studied journalism at the University of Georgia. I
Yes, indeed.
graduated in 2013, and when I graduated, the world was like completely different. I mean, Orange is the New Black wouldn't premiere for another like 2 months. So everything that Laverne Cox did to kind of shift how we talk about trans experiences, or the fact that we do talk about them publicly and in a mainstream way, hadn't quite happened yet. Janet Mock hadn't released her first memoir, Redefining Realness, yet, though she had shared her story in Marie Claire. But it was a different world, and I knew that there was a need to tell a story about being a Black trans girl from the South, because I still was kind of isolated, and I think in search of community. So the start of The Risk It Takes to Bloom really happened then, like there were seeds of it then. But I would say it started to coalesce more seriously in the lead up to the pandemic. And then once the pandemic hit, I was laid off from Out Magazine, which I talk about in the book. I was able to start kind of bringing this story together. And so, you kind of, although the book is technically broken up into 4 parts, I mean, I would say the two main chunks are, the first half is really my coming into my identity and my womanhood. And then the second part, while some of those pieces are still there, is my coming into social justice and activism and my career in a different way. And it felt very important to include both of these aspects of my life.
Yeah. I think it's going to be very relatable for people. I think people are going to enjoy hearing your story. You're such a public figure. People only see you in one way. So to hear more about like who you are, how you got to this moment, speaking at the march on the Women's March, right? What was that? 2017?
2017.
Right? Speaking after Angela Davis.
I know,
Right.
right?
These moments you've had and how you've owned them, stepped into them. I produce a pod, and a sister, Miss Connie Lindsay, she says we all need to learn how to cover all the ground we stand on, and
Mm.
it feels like that's exactly what you're doing out here in the world.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I had to kind of unpack. First of all, unpack this idea that I didn't have a story interesting enough or worthy enough of telling. Like, and I think that that's something that most authors probably go through, especially memoirists. But then I also had to unpack that I didn't have to tell my story in such a perfect, polished way. That there had to be room for disrespectability, as Tourmaline, the filmmaker, would say. Like there had to be space for the messiness, the nuances of life. And I think also what I hope to contribute to the canon is the story of a relatively conscious and aware Black trans woman who is more than just her transition or more than just her relationship to her gender and her body and these pieces, but someone who has also just, for better or worse, consistently been obsessed with the deeper implications of what my decisions to live my truth mean in the context of the world, in the context of our society.
Yeah. Yes to all of this. Yes to all of this. All right. So the book, The Risk It Takes to Bloom. So all your favorite places you get your books, go ahead and do that there. Hit the pre-order. We want this to be on all the lists. There's all the lists that happen when books come out. We want Raquel to be on all the lists. Will you have an audio book as well?
There will be an audiobook, yes.
Okay. Are
We're
you going
done recording? So
okay. Are you reading it yourself?
yes, I am. So exciting.
Oh, I love that. I love when authors read their books, especially when they're engaging, because the way you tell it, the way first person folks tell the story is just, it makes it so authentic. Okay, very good. Audible credits on the way. All right, y'all. Thank you so much, Raquel, for joining me today on the Queer News Podcast.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah. If you've enjoyed what you heard, rate and review us inside your favorite podcasting app. This podcast is written and produced by me, Anna DeShawn, and brought to you by E3 Radio and distributed on The Cube. We are Queer News Done Right.